guys, tonight we're drifting into another quiet journey through history. We're going to step way back, past the revolutionary noise and the terrible fast drama, and just sink into the quiet, heavily scented world of the 18th century French court. We're not looking for the guillotine yet. We're just wondering, how did the most famous queen of France, Marie Antoinette, actually live her weird, isolated, and ultimately tragic life? Just let the questions settle around you, maybe pull your blanket up a little higher. It's a nice, quiet way to spend the next hour or so following the slow burn story of a royal disaster. If you're finding this whole sleepy history thing helpful, a soft little click on the subscribe button or a gentle like would be a lovely way to let me know. Thanks. Now, let's go find a gilded room in Vienna and begin. Part 1. The Small Austrian Archduchess. We're going to start in a place of splendid, slightly exhausting royalty. Not in France yet, but in Vienna, in the enormous, sprawling court of the Habsburgs. Our subject starts life not as a queen of France, but as Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, the 15th and second youngest child of the Empress Maria Theresa. That's a massive family, a truly monumental number of royal children, all vying for their mother's attention and a good marriage contract. Maria Theresa was an empress who was frankly extremely busy. She was managing an empire, fighting wars, and having babies almost constantly. This meant that the youngest children, like little Antonia, were often raised in a slightly hands-off, industrialized royal setting. Maria Antonia was born in 1555. Her childhood was privileged, yes, but it was also a little chaotic and academically sparse. She wasn't particularly interested in serious study, and because she was always surrounded by people who loved her or who were paid to flatter her, she often managed to avoid things she didn't enjoy, like, say, learning to spell or reading Latin, because why not make it worse? She was, however, charming, pretty, and good at music and dancing. These were the skills that mattered most for a little archduchess whose primary purpose was to be a diplomatic pawn. The family drama defining her early life was the constant tension between the Habsburgs, Austria, and the Bourbons, France. These two great houses had been at each other's throats for centuries. But now, in a magnificent example of 18th century political convenience, they were trying to be friends. An alliance called the Diplomatic Revolution. The ultimate seal on this new, awkward friendship was a marriage, and little Antonia, being the youngest and most expendable unmarried princess, was the one chosen to be shipped off to France and married to the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. This wasn't a romance. It was a cold, hard, political contract. Antonia was essentially going to be a human treaty, binding two great powers together. Her mother, Maria Theresa, suddenly got very interested in Antonia's education when the French marriage contract was signed. The Empress realized that her daughter was woefully unprepared to deal with the savage, complicated court of Versailles. Suddenly, the lackadaisical girl was subjected to crash courses in French history, French language, and, most importantly, French court etiquette. It was a massive amount of pressure dumped onto a 14-year-old girl who had mostly been focused on playing the clavichord. In 1770, at the age of 14, Antonia left Vienna. The transition was marked by a bizarre, symbolic ritual at the border. At a small island pavilion on the Rhine, she was formally handed over from the Austrian delegation to the French. In a highly formalized, deeply symbolic move, she was stripped of every single piece of clothing and possession she had brought from Austria. her clothes, her jewelry, even her pet dog, and were dressed entirely in French attire. This was to symbolize that the Austrian Archduchess had ceased to exist, and only the French Dauphine, Marie Antoinette, remained. It was a brutal, total erasure of her identity. She arrived at Versailles as a political statement, completely alone and utterly unprepared for the silent, cold judgment of the French court. The silent, cold judgment of Versailles. Imagine Versailles in the 1770s. It was not a palace. It was a massive, complex, deeply dysfunctional organism. It was filled with thousands of courtiers, all locked in a perpetual, quiet battle for proximity, favor, and prestige. Every single action, every gesture, every piece of clothing, and every word spoken was scrutinized, judged, and used as a weapon. And into this terrifying snake pit stepped the 14-year-old, charming but academically thin Marie Antoinette. Her new husband was the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI. He was the complete opposite of her, 2 years older, shy, plump, awkward, and deeply religious. He was interested in hunting, mechanics, and locking systems. He preferred quiet, private study to the spectacular public theater of the court. He was called the Handsome, though honestly he looked like a worried, half-melted bourbon pudding. The marriage was, from the very start, an emotional and physical disaster. Louis was deeply reluctant to consummate the marriage. For 7 long years, years that Marie Antoinette spent under intense public scrutiny, the marriage remained unconsummated. This created a catastrophic royal problem. The primary job of a Dauphine and future queen was to produce an heir, a male heir, to ensure the Bourbon dynasty continued. The entire court, the entire nation was waiting for the pregnancy announcement, and nothing happened. The court whispered about the Dauphine's impotence, or his phimosis, a physical issue that might have been solved by a simple, minor surgery. The failure to produce an heir was not treated as a private medical matter, it was a public political scandal. Pamphlets circulated in Paris mocking the royal couple as the king and queen of nothing. Marie Antoinette was left deeply isolated. Her French was still imperfect. Her manners were too Austrian, which was a serious insult. And she was surrounded by the king's unmarried aunts, a terrifying group of deeply religious, conservative women known as the Mesdames Tantes, who hated her for being Austrian and for, well, existing. She responded to this constant, cold judgment with the only tools she had: distraction and consumption. She started to spend enormous amounts of money on clothes, jewelry, and gambling. She needed to escape the suffocating silence of her empty marital chambers and the perpetual scrutiny of the court. She found refuge in small, exclusive private parties with her young friends, escaping the rigidity of the terrifying 1,000-year-old Bourbon etiquette. This flight from duty was a terrible, self-sabotaging political move. She wasn't just gambling money. She was gambling her reputation and the public's perception of the monarchy. The court, starved for gossip, happily supplied the rumors. She was a reckless Austrian spendthrift. She was frivolous. She was secretly cheating on the Dauphine. The problem, as with most royal dramas, wasn't simple malice. It was youthful desperation meeting a profoundly dysfunctional system. She was just a lonely teenager trapped in the most performative, claustrophobic palace in Europe. The queen, the frivolity, and the public eye. In 1774, when Marie Antoinette was 18, her husband became King Louis XVI. She was now the Queen of France. This was supposed to be the moment of triumph. Instead, It was simply an amplification of her problems. The pressure to produce an heir became unbearable. The whispers became shouts. Finally, in 1777, after 7 years of this unbearable tension, Louis XVI received a visit from Marie Antoinette's much older, much wiser, and much more direct brother, Emperor Joseph II of Austria. Joseph stayed at Versailles for a month. He appalled the situation. He found his brother-in-law to be a bit of a blockhead and criticized his own sister for being frivolous and immature. But crucially, he wrote home confirming that the problem was indeed physical reluctance on the king's part. Joseph II, perhaps using his imperial authority and some very frank language, seems to have
the diamond necklace and the slander. As the 1780s dawned, the French nation was sinking fast under a mountain of debt, partially due to French support of the American Revolution, an ironic investment in republicanism, and partially due to the deeply unfair, antiquated tax system. In this atmosphere of public financial crisis, a scandal erupted that completely cemented Marie Antoinette's reputation as a greedy, foreign, reckless figure who was bleeding France dry. This was the affair of the diamond necklace. The key thing to know about this story is that Marie Antoinette was entirely innocent. The plot was orchestrated by a manipulative con artist, Jean de Valois Saint-Remy, who claimed to be a descendant of the royal Valois family. She convinced a high-ranking but deeply gullible cardinal, Louis de Rohan, that the queen was secretly in love with him. Jean told the cardinal that the queen wanted him to purchase an incredibly expensive diamond necklace, a piece commissioned for Madame Dugarry, Louis XV's mistress, but which the queen had in reality repeatedly refused to buy because of its outrageous cost. Jean claimed the queen was too embarrassed to be seen buying it publicly, so she needed the cardinal to act as her secret agent and front the money. The cardinal, desperate for the queen's favor, agreed. Jean and her accomplices then tricked the cardinal into believing he had met the queen in a fake midnight garden rendezvous. The queen was actually a prostitute hired to look like her. The cardinal bought the necklace, handed it over to Jean, and the con artists immediately broke it apart and sold the diamonds in London and Paris. When the king's jewelers demanded payment from the queen, the entire ludicrous plot unraveled. The king made the catastrophic political error of arresting the cardinal right in the middle of Versailles, turning the entire affair into a massive public trial. The trial ended with the cardinal being acquitted of all criminal charges, but Jean de Valois was found guilty. However, the damage was done. The trial had forced the Queen's name and image into the proceedings, giving the public a massive platform to air all the accumulated gossip and slander of the last 15 years. The public didn't believe the Queen was innocent. They believed she was a manipulative monster who had simply used the cardinal as a scapegoat to get the jewels. The slogan, Madame Deficit, stuck to her like glue. She was no longer a symbol of French stability. She was the embodiment of royal corruption and foreign arrogance. This scandal, which occurred just 5 years before the Revolution, was arguably the single greatest PR disaster in the history of the Bourbon monarchy. It meant that by 1789, the French people were already primed to believe the worst thing about their queen. The revolution begins and the failed escape. The financial and social crisis finally reached its boiling point. In 1789, the French Revolution began, kicked off by the storming of the Bastille. Marie Antoinette, despite all her political failings, was one of the few people at Versailles who seemed to grasp the seriousness of the threat. She was terrified, but she was also resolute in defending the monarchy. The situation became violently real in October 1789 with the Women's March on Versailles. thousands of angry, starving Parisian women marched the 12 miles to the palace, demanding bread and demanding that the king and queen return to Paris. The mob broke into the palace, massacring some of the royal guards. Marie Antoinette had to flee her apartment with her children, running down hidden passages to the king's rooms. It was a terrifying, chaotic, profoundly humiliating experience. The crowd demanded to see the queen. She famously stepped out onto the balcony, stood silently before the roaring, armed crowd, and then simply bowed. The raw courage of the gesture momentarily stunned the mob, but it didn't change the outcome. The royal family was forced to leave Versailles, the symbolic heart of their power, and were taken as virtual prisoners to the Tuileries Palace in the center of Paris. The next 2 years were spent in a state of increasingly stressed confinement. The king and queen were ostensibly still monarchs, but they were under the constant watch of revolutionary guards and the hostile Parisian populace. It became clear to Marie Antoinette, who correctly believed that the constitutional monarchy was doomed, that they had to escape. The plan was a collaboration with the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who was almost certainly her lover, adding another layer of quiet royal scandal. The flight to Versailles in June 1911 was a spectacular failure of execution. The plan was complex and hinged on secrecy and speed. Louis XVI, being obsessed with mechanics, insisted on commissioning an enormous, custom-built heavy coach that was slow, conspicuous, and highly recognizable. The family traveled in disguise, but the king, with his famously large nose and recognizable face, which was printed on every coin, was spotted by a local official at a post relay in Versailles. The family was stopped, detained, and then hauled back to Paris. The political consequences of the flight to Versailles were catastrophic and final. By trying to escape, the king had demonstrated that he was not loyal to the new French Constitution or the French people. It was the moment that turned the public mood irrevocably against the monarchy, paving the way for the Republic.
The fall, the trial, and the legacy. After the flight to Versailles, the fate of the royal family was sealed. Louis XVI was stripped of his title and power, and the family was imprisoned in the dark, medieval Temple Tower. The monarchy was formally abolished in September 1792. Louis XVI, now simply known as Citizen Louis Capet, was tried for treason. He was convicted and executed by guillotine in January 1793. Marie Antoinette, now Citizen Marie Capet, was left alone in the tower with her remaining children. Her emotional state must have been one of deep, profound, exhausted misery. All her frivolity, all her pettiness, all her early mistakes were now being paid for with terror, loss, and the death of her husband. She was transferred to the Conciergerie, a miserable, damp prison known as the antechamber to the guillotine, in August 1793. Her trial in October 1793 was a total farce. The charges included depleting the national treasury, treason, and a series of fabricated, truly vile accusations, including a charge of incest with her young son, which was so shocking that even some of the revolutionary women in the courtroom protested. Marie Antoinette, stripped of her glamour, her hair graying prematurely, behaved with remarkable dignity and stoicism. When confronted with the most outrageous charges, she simply appealed to the decency of the public, and her composure during the trial was one of the few genuinely heroic moments of her life. She was, of course, found guilty and condemned to death.
On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette rode through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, formerly the Place Louis XV, now the Place de la Concorde. Unlike her husband, who was taken in a closed carriage, she rode in an open cart, exposed to the insults and curses of the Parisian mob. Her final image, her hair shorn, her face pale, dressed simply in a white shift, was a stark, quiet contrast to the extravagant poufs and the diamond necklaces of her youth. She died with quiet grace. The legacy of Marie Antoinette is, ultimately, one of profound misunderstanding. She was a deeply flawed, frivolous, and politically naive young woman who was entirely ill-equipped to handle the immense pressures of the French crown. She became the perfect, beautiful, foreign scapegoat for a revolution that was truly caused by centuries of economic injustice, aristocratic privilege, and catastrophic royal debt. The story of Marie Antoinette is the story of a life consumed by spectacular irony, a life of unprecedented luxury that ended in the most absolute squalor. A foreign queen who tried to find comfort in a fake peasant village, and a woman who was destroyed not by malice, but by the weight of a system that demanded perfection and got youthful indiscretion instead. Let the slow, tragic movement of her life from gilded cradle to a simple, white shift ease you toward your rest. The shadows and the gossips. We ended with the profound tragedy of Marie Antoinette's final journey, but to fully understand the environment that destroyed her, we must return to the shadows and whispers of the court in the mid-1780s. The psychological cooker pressure of Versailles was relentless, and the Queen's only attempts at genuine connection often backfired spectacularly. One of the great sources of stress and gossip was the Queen's inner circle. This small group of friends she allowed into the Petit Trianon. This circle was viewed with deep suspicion by the traditional French aristocracy, who felt excluded, and exclusion at Versailles was the highest possible insult. Two figures in particular attracted the most venom. Marie Thérèse, Princess de Lamballe, a devout, shy, and gentle woman. She was the Queen's superintendent of the household. She was fiercely loyal, and Marie Antoinette cherished her quiet friendship. Yolande de Polignac. This was the controversial figure. Yolande was charming, beautiful, and deeply ambitious, or perhaps simply ambitious for her large, opportunistic family. The Queen showered the Polignac family with titles, money, and lucrative appointments. This was a classic, fatal mistake of absolute monarchy, granting enormous financial and social favors to personal favorites, thereby creating intense, visible resentment among the rest of the nobility who felt they deserved the rewards. The cost of maintaining the Polignac's lifestyle became a major talking point in the pamphlets. It fueled the narrative that the Austrian woman was surrounding herself with greedy, non-traditional favorites and wasting the French treasury on her own selfish pleasures. But let's pause and consider the emotional reality of the Queen herself. She was the Queen of France, yes, but she was a young woman desperately seeking authentic connection in a world where every single human interaction was transactional. The strict etiquette of Versailles meant that she couldn't choose her own companions. She had to be constantly on and performing. When she retreated to the Petit Trianon and sought solace in these small friendships, she was simply trying to carve out a tiny, safe space away from the thousand eyes judging her every breath. The Polignacs and Lamballes were for her a necessary emotional release. The irony, again, is profound. She sought privacy and sincerity, but the effort and cost of maintaining that privacy only amplified her public reputation as a corrupt and exclusive tyrant. The gossip around her supposed lesbian relationships with these friends only served to further dehumanize her in the public imagination, transforming her into a figure of pure, decadent foreign corruption. The political system of absolute monarchy was so broken that even the Queen's deepest emotional needs became fodder for revolution. She couldn't win. If she adhered to the suffocating public etiquette, she was cold and isolated. If she sought genuine friendship, she was deemed frivolous and corrupt, a terrible, silent trap. Let's drift over to another royal disaster, the king's crippling indecision and his mechanical mind.
The king's locks and the queen's politics. Marie Antoinette's tragedy is often viewed in isolation, but it was inextricably linked to the fatal flaws of her husband, King Louis XVI. Louis XVI was, by all accounts, a decent, moral man. He was dedicated to his family, intelligent in a practical sense, and genuinely tried to improve the lives of the French poor by abolishing some ancient abuses. But he was cursed with two traits that made him the worst possible monarch for the crisis-ridden 1780s. Crippling indecision. Louis XVI hated confrontation and could rarely make a firm, final decision on matters of state. He would often approve a reform one day, only to rescind it the next after being persuaded by a different faction. This political drift completely paralyzed the French government precisely when firm, swift action was needed to solve the massive financial debt. Mechanical obsession. The king was never more comfortable than when he was in his private workshop, tinkering with locks and keys. He possessed a surprising technical skill and loved the certainty and predictable logic of mechanical systems. In a chaotic world of political intrigue and mounting debt, he found solace in the precise, controllable logic of a well-made hinge or tumblers. This obsession became an ironic symbol of his failure. While the nation was crying out for a decisive political key to unlock reform and save the treasury, the king was happily absorbed in filing tiny metal pieces to perfect a complex lock that served no purpose other than distracting him. Because, why not make it worse? Marie Antoinette, on the other hand, was growing more and more politically engaged as the situation worsened. After years of being told to stay away from politics, the French rule was that queens should not meddle. She saw her husband's indecision as a fatal weakness. She became associated with the Austrian Committee, a supposed cabal of royalists, conservatives, and, yes, Austrians, who pushed the king to take a firmer, more reactionary stance against the early revolutionary movements. This shift was born of panic, not ideology. She was simply trying to save her husband and her children. This political shift, however, cemented her image as the evil foreign puppet master. It confirmed every pamphlet's accusation that the Austrian woman was secretly pulling the strings, subverting the true French interests, and pushing the kind, simple French king toward tyranny. The contrast between the two royal figures is deeply tragic. Louis XVI had the best intentions, but lacked the political will. Marie Antoinette eventually found the political will, but lacked the popular legitimacy.
Together, their complementary flaws ensured the dynasty's final, spectacular collapse. The monarchy was doomed not just by poverty and injustice, but by the fatal mismatch of the two main personalities sitting on the throne. Let's drift over to another royal disaster, the fate of the children in the Temple Tower. Children of the Revolution. The ultimate quiet tragedy of the French Revolution is the fate of the royal children, the innocent victims caught in the eye of the dynastic storm. When the royal family was first imprisoned in the Temple Tower in August 1792, they were still a unit. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their surviving daughter, Marie Thérèse, aged 14, and their young son, the Dauphin Louis Carl, aged 7, who was technically the new king of France in the eyes of the royalists. Life in the Temple Tower was a slow, psychological torture. The family was subjected to constant, humiliating surveillance. Guards watched them eat, watched them sleep, and ensured they were cut off from the outside world. When Louis XVI was taken away and executed in January 1793, the family was left in an unimaginable state of grief and fear. Marie Antoinette, the woman previously known for her frivolous spending, became a figure of silent, resolute maternal strength, focused only on protecting her children in that grim, isolated prison. But the revolution was not finished with its symbolic dismantling of the monarchy. The most agonizing moment came in July 1793, when the 7-year-old Dauphin, Louis Carl, was forcibly taken from his mother. Imagine that scene, the guards coming into the miserable, candlelit room and dragging the small boy away from her terrified mother, who was utterly powerless to stop them. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to break the Queen's spirit and sever the last vestige of the Bourbon line. Louis Carl was placed in the care of a simple cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was instructed to re-educate the boy as a true citizen of the Republic. The little Dauphin, who royalists considered Louis XVII, was subjected to a brutal, deliberate effort to erase his identity. He was taught revolutionary songs, forced to denounce his parents, and was allegedly subjected to neglect and abuse. This sad, small boy, the heir to the most magnificent monarchy in Europe, simply wasted away in the prison. He died in June 1795, likely from tuberculosis and neglect, at the age of 10. The final pitiful end to the male line of the Bourbon dynasty, not in a great battle or a scaffold, but in a damp, isolated cell. His sister, Marie Thérèse, was left alone to endure the terror. She was a teenager who watched her father, her mother, and her brother, all taken from her by the same brutal political force. She was eventually released in 1795 in a prisoner exchange, the only survivor of the immediate royal family. Her life was one of permanent, deep-seated grief and reactionary bitterness, a testament to the lasting psychological damage inflicted by the revolution. The quiet suffering of these royal children, trapped in their cold prison tower, while the glorious ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity raged outside, remains one of the most poignant and tragic footnotes to the entire era. The ultimate price of the Queen's early mistakes was paid by those who could not possibly understand them. Let's drift over to another royal disaster, the financial collapse that Marie Antoinette didn't actually cause.
The debt that ate France. The popular legend holds that Marie Antoinette's excessive spending, the poufs, the petit trianon, the jewelry, was the direct cause of the French Revolution. This is a wonderfully dramatic, simple narrative, but it is historically inaccurate. While Marie Antoinette was undoubtedly frivolous and spent massive sums on luxury, her spending was actually a tiny fraction of the overall national debt. The real culprit was far more mundane, persistent, and structural: debt, war, and the tax code. The massive, crippling debt that ate France was primarily caused by war debt, the cost of the 7 Years' War, which ended right before Marie Antoinette arrived, and, ironically, the cost of supporting the American Revolution. Louis XVI's decision to financially back the American colonists to spite the British was an enormous expense that bankrupted the already strained treasury. Interest payments. The vast majority of the king's annual budget, sometimes over 50%, went not toward new spending, but simply toward paying the interest on previously accrued debt. It was a fiscal death spiral. The king and his finance ministers, like Necker, knew the solution was simple: tax the privileged. For centuries, the French tax code had been divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, paid almost no direct taxes. The second estate, the nobility, paid almost no direct taxes. The third estate, everyone else, paid crushing taxes, fees, and tithes. The only way to solve the debt was to make the enormously wealthy first and second estates contribute. But the privileged classes used their political power to block every single reform attempt by the king and his ministers. Every time a finance minister suggested taxing the nobility forced the king to fire the minister. This is the great, quiet failure of Louis XVI. He had the power to force the nobility to pay taxes, but he lacked the political backbone to do so. He simply couldn't endure the confrontation. Marie Antoinette became the easy, visible target for public rage. It was easier for the Parisian mobs and the pamphlet writers to rage against a diamond necklace or a fake peasant village than to understand the complex, dull reality of fiscal policy and interest payments. She became the symbolic lightning rod for the deep, structural flaws of the entire Ancien regime. Her personal debt was negligible, but her symbolic debt, the visual proof of royal waste, was immense. The ultimate irony: she was executed for bankrupting France when the real culprits were the entrenched, selfish privileges of the same nobility who stood back and watched her go to the guillotine. Let the slow boredom and the weight of the debt sink into your sleep. Good night, and may you never have to deal with complex 18th century fiscal policy. The Queen's appearance and the power of the portrait. We often forget that Marie Antoinette's image was in itself a powerful and highly controlled piece of political propaganda, at least until the pamphlets took over. Before the Revolution, the Queen's appearance was governed by the art of the court portrait. These paintings were not just pretty pictures. They were carefully managed political statements designed to project specific qualities: power, fertility, and glamour. In the early years, the portraits emphasized her youth and Austrian charm. But as the controversy around her spending grew, Marie Antoinette, in a few key moments, tried to use her portraiture to rehabilitate her image. One of the most famous and politically disastrous of these attempts was the 1783 portrait by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, where the Queen was shown in a simple muslin chemise dress and a straw hat. This was the same simple dress she favored in the privacy of the Petit Trianon. The painting was immediately controversial when it was shown at the Paris Salon. The public and the court were shocked and outraged. They felt that a Queen of France should never be painted in such underwear or peasant clothing. It was seen as an insult to the dignity of the crown and, ironically, an insult to the French silk industry. The Queen was forced to immediately commission a replacement portrait where she was dressed in a more traditional silk gown.
because why not make it worse? Her attempt to look simpler, more natural, and less extravagant was interpreted as a scandalous political gaffe. This incident shows how impossible her life had become. She was trapped by her image. If she wore diamonds and silk, she was Madame Deficit. If she wore simple muslin, she was insulting French tradition and the nation's industry. The power of the pamphlet ultimately destroyed the Queen's image much more effectively than any court artist could restore it. The revolutionary pamphlets, often crude, vicious, and pornographic, completely took control of her narrative. They focused on her alleged affairs, her gambling, and her waste, transforming her from a naive Austrian girl into a grotesque symbol of national corruption. The ultimate image, the serene, dignified, gray-haired woman on the scaffold, was the only one truly outside the control of the gossips and the artists. It was an image of pure, quiet endurance, the final dramatic and irreversible contrast of her life. Let the slow visual transformation of the Queen's image from the silk poufs to the simple white shift settle into your sleep.
The quiet terror and the end of etiquette. Before the final trip to the guillotine, the greatest suffering Marie Antoinette endured was the quiet, unrelenting destruction of her dignity during her time as a prisoner in the Temple Tower and the Conciergerie. Life at Versailles was defined by etiquette, a dizzying, complex system of rules that dictated every action, from how the Queen woke up, the lever, to how she ate and dressed. While suffocating and dehumanizing in its own way, this etiquette also provided a shield. It defined the boundaries of her royal person and her authority. In the prison, the revolution's goal was to completely dismantle this etiquette and destroy the royal persona, reducing the Queen to the status of a common citizen. The guards in the Temple Tower were specifically chosen to be rude, crude, and openly contemptuous of the prisoners. They were deliberately vulgar, smoking and spitting in the royal presence, refusing to address the King and Queen with their titles, and keeping them under relentless surveillance. For Marie Antoinette, this daily, constant assault on her dignity must have been an absolute psychological grind. The physical cold and the lack of sanitation were awful, but the destruction of the sacred ritual of kingship was perhaps worse. The most profound example was her final transfer to the Conciergerie. This was a place of extreme squalor. She was given a tiny, miserable cell, constantly watched by 2 guards who never left her side, even when she needed to use the toilet, which was often just a simple bucket. Imagine the absolute bone-deep humiliation for a woman whose entire life had been defined by the most elaborate public rituals of privacy and privilege. Every act of basic human necessity was now a public performance for 2 hostile, low-ranking revolutionary guards. The cold was secondary to the shame. She was left with nothing more than her inner composure. There were no more jewels, no more friends, no more power, and no more etiquette. All that remained was the quiet, cold resolve that she was the Queen of France, and they could not force her to break down. This final, slow-burned psychological torture, the relentless chipping away at her identity, was the quiet finale before the loud moment of the execution. It was a calculated, brutal way to prepare a queen for death by ensuring she had already lost everything that made her royal. Let the sound of the king's final lock click shut on the cold, empty dignity of the queen settle into your rest. Good night, and may your privacy never be invaded.